Title: Real American Horror Story, Episode 2, The Cursed Amulet. It was a crisp autumn afternoon when James Carter found the amulet. He was an archaeology student, spending his weekends exploring old sites and antique shops in search of hidden treasures. That day, he had ventured into an old, nearly forgotten store on the outskirts of town. The place was cluttered with all sorts of strange artifacts, but one item caught his eye immediately. It was a small, intricately designed amulet made of a dark, tarnished metal that seemed almost to absorb the light. The shopkeeper, an old man with a distant look in his eyes, noticed James staring at the amulet. "Ah, you found it," the man said, his voice tinged with something James couldn't quite place. "That amulet has a long and dark history, young man. It's not something to be taken lightly." But James was intrigued. His curiosity piqued. He asked the man about the amulet's origins, but the old man only shook his head. "Some things are better left unknown," he warned. But James didn't listen. He purchased the amulet, feeling a strange sense of excitement as he left the store. That night, as he sat in his small apartment, James examined the amulet more closely. It was covered in strange symbols, unlike anything he had ever seen before. He felt a strange connection to it, as if it was calling to him, drawing him in. He decided to do some research, hoping to uncover its origins. But the more he learned, the more uneasy he became. The amulet was said to be cursed, bringing misfortune and death to anyone who possessed it. But James dismissed these stories as mere superstition, convinced that he had stumbled upon something truly unique. As he went to bed that night, he placed the amulet on his nightstand, unaware of the horrors that awaited him. That night, James had the first of many nightmares. He found himself in a dark, ancient temple, the walls lined with grotesque statues. In the center of the temple was an altar, and on it lay the amulet, glowing with an eerie light. He felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if something terrible was about to happen. Suddenly, the statues began to move, their stone faces twisted in agony. They reached out towards him, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. James tried to run, but his feet wouldn't move. He was rooted to the spot, forced to watch as the statues closed in on him. He awoke with a start, his heart pounding in his chest. The room was dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside his window. But as he lay there, trying to calm his racing heart, he noticed something strange. The amulet, which had been on his nightstand, was now lying on the pillow next to him. His blood ran cold as he stared at it, unable to understand how it had moved. But he told himself it must have been a trick of the mind, a result of the terrifying nightmare. He placed the amulet back on the nightstand and tried to go back to sleep. But the feeling of unease lingered. Over the next few days, the nightmares grew worse. Each night he found himself back in the temple, the same terrifying scenario playing out again and again. And each morning, the amulet would be lying next to him, as if it had a life of its own. He became obsessed with the amulet, unable to shake the feeling that it was somehow connected to his nightmares. He spent hours researching its history, but every lead ended in mystery and fear. As the days went on, James began to notice strange things happening around him. Objects would move on their own, lights would flicker, and he often felt as though he was being watched. The atmosphere in his apartment grew heavy, oppressive, as if the very air was thick with malevolence. His friends noticed the change in him, his once bright and cheerful demeanor replaced by a constant state of anxiety and paranoia. They tried to reach out to him, but he pushed them away, consumed by his obsession with the amulet. He began to see things, shadowy figures lurking in the corners of his vision, only to disappear when he turned to look. He heard whispers, faint and indistinct, but filled with malice. It was as if the amulet was slowly driving him mad, breaking down his sanity piece by piece. Desperate for answers, he returned to the old shop where he had bought the amulet. But when he arrived, he found the shop abandoned, the windows boarded up, and the door locked. It was as if the shop had never existed, leaving James with no one to turn to. He knew he had to get rid of the amulet, but every time he tried to throw it away, it would reappear, as if bound to him by some dark force. He even tried to destroy it, but nothing he did could harm it. It was indestructible, an unbreakable link to the curse that now consumed his life. James's life continued to spiral out of control. He lost his job, his friends, and even his health, as the curse took its toll on him. He barely slept, haunted by the nightmares that plagued him every night. His apartment became a prison, filled with the whispers and shadows that tormented him. He became a shell of his former self, consumed by fear and paranoia. He knew that the amulet was the source of his torment, but he was powerless to rid himself of it. It was as if the amulet had a will of its own, determined to drag him down into the darkness. One night, after yet another terrifying nightmare, James made a decision. He would return to the temple in his dreams, confront whatever force was behind the amulet, and end the curse, once and for all. He placed the amulet around his neck, feeling its cold weight against his chest, and lay down on his bed. He closed his eyes, willing himself to return to the temple, to face the darkness head-on. As soon as he fell asleep, he found himself back in the temple, the same twisted statues surrounding him. But this time, he was not afraid. He walked towards the altar, where the amulet lay, glowing with that same eerie light. He reached out to touch it, but as soon as his fingers brushed against it, the ground beneath him began to shake. The temple walls cracked and crumbled, and the statues came to life, their stone faces contorted in rage. But James stood his ground, determined to end the nightmare. He grabbed the amulet, tearing it from the altar, and held it up to the statues. The statues recoiled, their glowing eyes dimming, as if the amulet held some power over them. But then the temple began to collapse, the walls crumbling around him. James ran, the amulet clutched in his hand, but there was no escape. The ground gave way beneath him, and he fell into darkness, the amulet slipping from his grasp. James awoke in his apartment, drenched in sweat, the amulet nowhere to be found. He felt a strange sense of relief, as if the curse had finally been lifted. But as he got out of bed, he realized something was wrong. The apartment was different, the air thick with a sense of dread. He walked to the mirror, but the reflection that stared back at him was not his own. The face was twisted, deformed, a grotesque mockery of his own features. He touched his face but felt nothing. It was as if he was trapped in a body that was no longer his own. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. He hadn't escaped the curse. He had become a part of it. The amulet had taken everything from him, his life, his sanity, and now his very identity. He was trapped in a nightmare, a prisoner of the curse that he had unleashed, and there was no escape. The amulet was never found, but the story of James Carter became a cautionary tale. It was a reminder of the dangers of greed, of the perils of seeking power and knowledge that was never meant to be found. James had been driven by curiosity, by the desire to uncover the secrets of the past, but it had cost him everything. His story was a lesson in the consequences of meddling with forces beyond our understanding. of the dangers of ignoring the warnings that life gives us. It was a reminder that some things are better left buried, that some knowledge is not worth the price. The Cursed Amulet may still be out there, waiting for its next victim. But those who hear James's story know to steer clear, to respect the warnings of the past. Because some curses are not meant to be broken, and some nightmares never end. End of Episode 2. The Cursed Amulet.